Beneath the vaulted ceiling of the Grand Summit Hall, the air tasted of polished ozone and ancient, cold stone. Above the central dais, massive military holograms bathed the tiered seating in a harsh, blue luminescence. The elder species were displaying their strength. Fleets of dreadnoughts and plasma-forged artillery rotated slowly in the air, casting long, sharp shadows over the human delegation standing at the center of the floor. The Lumina archivist stood perfectly still by the southern pillar, balancing a heavy stack of crystalline data slates against his chest. His job was to record the history of Ethelgard, not to participate in it. But even from the periphery, he could feel the immense, suffocating weight of the room's judgment pressing down. Consul Elias Thorne of Terra stood before the central podium. He had brought no holograms. He had authorized no martial display. Laughter rippled through the Lumina Hegemony's seating block. It wasn't a loud sound, just a collective, dismissive breath of amusement that echoed off the obsidian walls. Beneath it all, the low, rhythmic hum of the Grand Summit Hall's climate control scrubbers cycled on. A steady vibration felt through the soles of the archivist's boots. It was the sound of a galaxy entirely unimpressed. At the very back of the Terran formation, separated from the diplomats and the glowing projections, stood another human. Cade Sterling. He wasn't watching the holograms of the Lumina warships. He was staring at a static, physical projection of an ancient galactic map, his focus locked entirely on the dead sectors. His hands were tucked completely inside thick, dark leather gloves. He hadn't spoken a single word since the delegation's transport landed. I'll be honest with you. The silence of a human is a terrifying thing, but you only ever realize it when it's too late. Listen closely to what happened next. Archon Vespera leaned forward from the highest observation tier, her crystalline robes catching and refracting the holographic light. She gestured toward the back of the human group with a slender, glowing finger, her voice amplified across the hall. "And who is your silent shadow, Consul?" Vespera asked, her tone dripping with polished condescension. "A cultural attaché? A servant sent to carry your empty threats." The archivist prepared his stylus to record Thorne's diplomatic defense. It never came. Instead, a frantic, scratching sound caught the archivist's attention. To his immediate left, the Chitinkin arbiter had frozen in his seat. The arbiter's mandibles clicked rapidly, a physiological response to, "No, that wasn't diplomatic protocol. That was raw terror." The arbiter didn't speak a word to the Archon. He reached beneath his heavy, ceremonial robes and shattered a sealed diplomatic beacon. A crimson light flashed across the archivist's peripheral vision. A high-priority security alert, broadcast silently to the encrypted slates of the inner circle. The archivist's own datapad vibrated violently with the warning. Priority 0. Threat identity confirmed. Do not engage. The archivist stared at the glowing red text, and then looked back down at the human in the dark gloves. A servant? No servant warranted a Priority 0 alert from a Chitinkin elder. What had the arbiter seen in that quiet man that an entire hall of advanced species had missed? The crimson alert pulsed on the datapad, a silent heartbeat beneath the continued diplomatic droning. Vespera kept up her grandstanding, completely unaware of the encrypted panic radiating from the Chitinkin sector. The archivist could no longer focus on the speeches. Every time his eyes drifted to his slate, the red warning glared back. Every time he looked up, the human named Sterling was still just standing there, studying the dead space on the map. Then, the heavy doors of the northern corridor slid open. A Lumina security detail marched into the hall, their armor scuffed. They weren't dragging a prisoner. They were carrying a body. The archivist stepped forward, his breath catching in his throat. It was a Scardic Union assassin. The alien's gray, scaled skin was unblemished, but he was completely unconscious. Far more chilling was what a guard carried on a magnetic tray right behind him. A military-grade plasma blade and 3 neurotoxin injectors. They hadn't been shattered or damaged in a struggle. They had been meticulously disassembled into their fundamental component parts and arranged in a neat, symmetrical grid on the metal tray. Unsettling. Who could dismantle a weapon in the dark without leaving a single scratch on the casing? The summit erupted into chaos. The Galactic Union delegation rose as one, their heavy armor clattering in the cavernous space. Accusations of assassination and sabotage flew across the dais. The Lumina hegemony fiercely denied any involvement, claiming the Galactic assassin had been planted to frame them. The Galactic representative didn't wait for an official investigation. He formally withdrew from the peace negotiations on the spot. 10 minutes later, the grand observation windows of the summit hall darkened as deep space telemetry updated. Thousands of Galactic warships, previously cloaked at the system's edge, ignited their sublight thrusters. A full-scale invasion of luminous space had just begun. Panic consumed the hall. Diplomats fled toward the evacuation shuttles. Lumina generals shouted tactical formations into their comms, rushing toward the subterranean war room. Through the absolute pandemonium, the archivist watched Cade Sterling. The human hadn't moved an inch. He simply adjusted the cuffs of his leather gloves, his gaze still fixed perfectly on the dead sectors of the map, listening to the climate scrubbers hum. The subterranean war room of Ethelgard smelled of superheated copper and the bitter tang of panic sweat. The archivist sat sequestered in the recessed observation ring, his data slate trembling slightly in his hands as infinite streams of tactical telemetry flooded the massive curved screens. The Galactic Union had crossed the Valari expanse. 3,000 warships, a tidal wave of heavy armor and unmatched aggression, moving with a terrifying logistical rhythm toward the Lumina capital. Below the screens, Lumina generals shouted across expansive holographic plotting tables. They calculated casualty projections in the billions. They plotted desperate, suicidal choke points that would only delay the inevitable destruction of their homeworld. The sheer scale of the martial display on the monitors was suffocating. Then, the heavy blast doors hissed open. The Kite-Kin arbiter entered the bunker, flanked by heavily armed security personnel. Behind him walked Cade Sterling. The human had not been invited to the command bunker. He had been demanded. Archon Vespera turned from the central holodable, her crystalline features pale and fracturing light in erratic patterns of immense stress. She looked at the human, the supposed cultural attaché she had so effortlessly mocked only hours earlier. "You," Vespera whispered, the word carrying across the deadened acoustics of the bunker. "The Arbiter claims you are an endmaker." Sterling stepped up to the glowing blue projection of the Galactic Armada. He didn't look at the terrifying wedge of warships. He looked exclusively at the thin, trailing supply lines stretching back into the dark sectors. "The Gravedigger," the Arbiter corrected from the shadows, his voice a dry, echoing rasp of absolute reverence. While the Lumina tacticians screamed themselves hoarse calculating orbital interception trajectories and plasma yields, the human from Terra stood in the center of the subterranean command bunker, doing absolutely nothing but watching the sweeping lines of the logistical supply routes. Sterling finally placed his hands on the console rim. The dark leather gloves seemed to absorb the ambient blue light of the holodable. "You don't need a fleet," Sterling said. His voice was quiet, lacking any theatrical inflection or urgency. "You need a broadcast tower." He reached forward and tapped 3 specific nodes on the galactic map. The Galactic commanders operate on immense ego and deep-seated clan rivalries. They coordinate this massive invasion force through the sacred etheric resonance channels. It is their holy frequency. No one touches it out of respect for the old treaties. Vesper stared at him in horror. To desecrate those channels is a supreme violation of galactic law. "I am not going to jam them," Sterling replied, his focus never leaving the map. "I am going to crowd them." The archivist dutifully recorded the exact moment the human executed the plan. It was not a magnificent martial display. It was a cold, calculated masterpiece of unseen ruin. Sterling interfaced a small, featureless drive into the command console. The archivist watched the human's hands, remembering the meticulously disassembled assassin's blade in the summit hallway, and realized Sterling was approaching an entire galactic armada with the exact same terrifying precision. He uploaded a localized, highly sophisticated data cascade directly into the sacred frequencies. He didn't block their communications. Instead, he flooded their localized networks with ghost signals, contradictory supply requisitions, and fabricated insults perfectly mimicking the secure cryptographic signatures of rival Skardic warlords. The result, watched in absolute silence by the Lumina High Command, was horrifyingly instantaneous. The pristine logistical rhythm of the invasion force shattered. Supply ships, receiving forged orders of treason, diverted to phantom coordinates. Heavy dreadnoughts turned their massive plasma weapons on their own allied cruisers, fully believing a massive clan mutiny had begun within the ranks. Without their vital fuel lines arriving on schedule, the massive engines of the Skardic vanguard starved. The armada just stopped. 3 days. That was all it took. A 3-day war fought entirely with weaponized noise and engineered paranoia. The Skardic Union, the most feared and heavily armed military force in the quadrant, collapsed into total infighting. They surrendered without the Lumina hegemony firing a single defensive plasma battery. The archivist watched the final surrender telemetry scroll across his slate, a cold, heavy knot forming deep in his primary stomach. 3 days to dismantle an empire, and the human hadn't even. The dark gloves never came off. Warlord Krell Voss, his mighty fleet dead in the vacuum and his localized commanders executing one another in paranoid frenzies, offered his unconditional surrender. The transmission was broadcast directly into the war room. The warlord did not offer his blade to the Archon. He transmitted his capitulation directly to the quiet man from Terra, openly begging for the restraint the human had shown by not deploying the data cascade to their civilian core worlds. The archivist documented the heavy silence that fell over the Lumina generals. Hours ago, they had laughed at the humans' lack of holographic warships. Now, they looked at him with an undisguised, suffocating dread. They finally understood that true strength was not defined by the capacity for spectacular violence, but by the terrifying discipline required to withhold it. Sterling had not fired a single shot, yet he had broken the cycle of galactic vengeance simply by turning an empire's pride against itself. On a high balcony overlooking the capital, Archon Vespera slowly lowered her head, performing the deep Velorth gesture of absolute submission toward the departing Terran. Sterling never looked back to accept the honors. Hours later, the architect of a bloodless ruin sat in the scuffed, synthetic leather of a standard civilian transport seat. His breathing deepened into sleep, his dark leather gloves resting quietly in his lap.